Since its inception, the extraction game Escape from Tarkov has combined player versus player and player versus environment gameplay in a unique, usually chaotic way, resulting in what's been termed a PvPvE experience. This has inspired an entire genre of games trying to grab the attention of a newfound audience. Hunt Showdown, Delta Force, Marathon, to name a few, all jumped on the extraction bandwagon. By crafting a game that leans in on the competitive nature of PvP and leverages PvE to fill in the gaps, Tarkov embraced its existence as being punishingly hard, with only the most obsessive and competitive players able to be successful. Until it didn't. Escape from Tarkov, the granddaddy of the modern PvPvE extraction genre, recently released their full, if extremely overpriced, support for a pure PvE mode. On top of this, there have been a slew of games announced or even released recently, like Witchfire or Forever Winter, in the extraction genre that don't have PvP support, and according to the devs, never will. Which begs the question, does PvP even matter for extraction games? I mean, games which aren't competitive seem so much easier to make, right? Not needing to worry about the overhead of escalating server costs, fighting off the crazy obsessive cheaters, or a potential balancing nightmare across multiple player skill gaps. Doesn't PvE just make for a better experience overall? Most importantly, doesn't that make the acronym PvPvE easier to say? To figure that out, first, let's understand what these kind of games even are, why it works so well, and get into some examples of how games are trying to go without PvP entirely. Finally, we'll go over the key features needed to be successful here. A player versus player, or PvP game, is any game in which more than one player is pitted against each other in a fierce battle. Be that by shooting each other in Counter-Strike, hitting balls at each other with a paddle in Pong, or waging war in StarCraft. Players get their fun by besting each other in finely tuned battles, using their skills and tools to win out over their rivals. Player versus environment, or PvE games, are where that opposing role is taken on by traditional AI. The computer using algorithms, perfect information of what the player is doing, and a hefty amount of fakery to act as an opposition to the player. Combining the two was generally considered to be a bad idea. The general thinking was always that players who prefer PvP want a purist experience. They don't want enemy AI messing up the gameplay of their performance, while PvE is always seen as a less intimidating mode for players to engage in many ways easier. Yet extraction games successfully buck this belief and combine both. They do this by changing what it means to win. In any round of Valorant, the way to win is super clear. Kill other players. Even in games of Overwatch, where players are moving a tank through gates to get to the end, the best way to accomplish this is kill other players. In an extraction game, a player's goal is rarely to kill every other player on the map. In fact, many times, a successful session results in never even seeing other players. Almost every extraction game provides the player with tasks to achieve, which serve as a way to add some direction, but beyond completing tasks, the overriding goal, most of the time, is to collect loot and safely extract. For many players, myself included, PvP is often opportunistic, in some cases undesirable. Sure, there are of course some players who just want to fight other players, and that's totally okay. In most cases, players set their own goals for each session. Sometimes these goals come from missions given by the game. other times from a need for items for their base upgrade. Sometimes it's just a desire to loot and embrace whatever random events happen. That's exactly what makes extraction games so interesting. Players define their own goals. And it's why PvE is such an important element. Without having some form of AI on the battlefield for the players to fight, if players were able to avoid PvP, you would end up with the most gameplay sessions resulting in there not being any combat. And combat is usually a core component of these games. If most sessions didn't have any, well, the game might be considered boring. PvP also naturally generates content. Every player interaction is unique, meaning that even if the same map or mission is replayed, the experience will always vary depending on the people involved. This emergent gameplay means that developers don't need to create as much handcrafted content to keep the game fresh. Players themselves contribute to the variety. But as great as PvP is, it has its downsides. Balancing PvP games is notoriously tricky across different skill levels. Developers can find themselves in a constant battle to prevent hackers from ruining the experience for others, not to mention the inherent just stress of PvP. For many players, the idea of jumping into a high-stakes player versus player environment is anxiety-inducing, making PvE a more accessible and enjoyable option. PvE-only extraction games represent kind of a growing trend that aims to capture the best elements of extraction gameplay without the stress of PvP. The appeal of PvE is clear. It's a less intimidating way to engage with the genre, allowing players to experience the same survival, resource gathering, and mission-based gameplay without the constant threat of being ambushed by other players. Let's look at a few key titles that are proving PvE-only extraction can work, and explore what they're doing right. Witchfire is a first-person shooter that puts a heavy emphasis on its atmospheric world, enemy design, and high-stakes combat. It's a PvE extraction game where players dive into this dark, cursed land reminiscent of Elden Ring to gather resources, slay terrifying enemies, and escape before they're overwhelmed. By focusing on tough, handcrafted enemy encounters and meaningful loot progression, Witchfire creates a high level of tension and challenge without needing PvP. Bosses and waves of enemies are well tuned to test players, creating an experience where every move counts. In Forever Winter, a survival-based extraction game, players contend with the brutal environment as much as they do with the enemies. The game blends survival mechanics with the extraction gameplay, forcing players to make difficult decisions about resource management, exploration, and combat as they try to survive long enough to extract. With no PvP in sight, the game relies on environmental hazards and relentless AI enemies to keep the tension high. And then there's Road to Vostok, a hardcore survival extraction game still very early in development. This one focuses heavily on realism, kind of like Tarkov, with a strong emphasis on immersion and strategic gameplay. The lack of PvP allows the developers to focus on making every encounter with AI very meaningful, ensuring that the game remains tense and challenging despite the absence of human opponents. All of these games demonstrate that PvE extraction can be both fun and engaging. But creating a compelling PvE extraction game isn't easy. In the absence of PvP, developers need to address several key challenges. The most crucial factor here is the moment-to-moment gameplay. When you're not battling real players, the game needs to fill that gap with interesting, dynamic moments. Take Witchfire, for example. The second-to-second experience, jumping, dodging, and navigating through the map, shooting a gun which rings a bell whenever you hit it. Is what keeps you engaged. The gunplay is smooth, the weapons are exciting to use, and there's always something happening. Whether you're leveling up new guns or unlocking new abilities, the gameplay feels fast-paced and reactive. Without PvP, the focus shifts more heavily to how satisfying that core gameplay loop is. The movement, the shooting, the map navigation, it all needs to feel incredibly tight and fun. One of the biggest challenges with PvE extraction games is keeping enemy encounters engaging. If you don't have real players surprising you at every turn, AI has to pick up the slack. This means developers need to invest way more in AI enemy encounter design. If you look at games like Fear, Half-Life, or XCOM, the AI in these games feels really smart. It reacts to your actions, it adapts, and it can create moments of tension that keep you on your toes. This is absolutely essential, because if the AI is too predictable or repeatable, players lose interest really fast. They feel like they've solved the problem of the AI. It's too easy to beat. In PvP, human players bring that unpredictability, but in PvE, the AI must fill that role. You can't rely on humans to create chaos, so the enemies need to feel like a legitimate threat. And this is where Witchfire shines again. The way it stages enemy encounters, the randomness in how they appear, and their unique behaviors keep the player engaged, even when they're the only human in the match. Another critical factor is content. In PvP games, players themselves create a lot of the content through their interactions. Whether it's the rivalry or unexpected alliances, the human element makes every match feel different. But in PvE, that just can't happen. This is why games like Forever Winter or Witchfire focus so much on staging dynamic events or using static maps with randomized content. While the maps might remain the same, what happens during each run needs to change. This could be where enemies spawn, random weather effects, or special events that trigger unpredictably. It's a lot like how World of Warcraft structured its adventure mode. Even though the world stays constant, the dynamic changes within it make each experience feel new. In a PvP environment, difficulty often naturally scales. Better players face better opponents. But in PvE, it's on the developer to create that sense of progressive challenge. Without the inherent difficulty of competing against other players, these games need to ensure the challenge scales along with the player's progress. If you're getting stronger, so must the AI. Witchfire does this well by increasing the intensity of enemies and their abilities as you level up. This lets the player feel like they're becoming more powerful, but it keeps the gameplay challenging at every step. It's about crafting a difficulty curve that feels designed so players don't become too comfortable, but they also don't feel completely overwhelmed. And without PvP, developers have more control over this curve. They can create these curated experiences where players are pushed to their limits at just the right moments. So, can a pure PvE extraction game work? Absolutely, but it requires a very different approach to design than its PvPvE counterpart. Games like Witchfire and Forever Winter showed that if you focus on tight, engaging, moment-to-moment gameplay, invest in intelligent AI, scale difficulty with player progression, and keep content fresh through live updates, you can build a PvE extraction game that keeps players coming back for more. Ultimately, it's about creating a well-balanced experience that challenges players, rewards their time,